What if the strongest scent of femininity in one of Korea's most legendary kingdoms wasn't perfume but fermented animal fat? What if beauty was measured not by how fresh you looked, but by how intensely you smelled? Welcome to the Goguryeo kingdom, a mighty empire that rose from the mists of Northeast Asia around 37 BCE and endured for centuries. But beneath its military glory and shamanic rituals, there was another story, a story told through cloth soaked in garlic, braided hair sealed with deer grease, and bodies untouched by water for weeks. These weren't just hygiene habits. They were sacred codes, cultural shields, and sometimes silent screams. You may laugh or grimace now, but back then these were marks of pride, not shame. So, how did women truly live in that raw, frozen world? Let's find out together in this video. The wind glided quietly through the mountain ridges of the north, brushing past thatched roofs and weaving into the wooden walls of ancient homes. Under a pale moon, the once mighty kingdom of Goguryeo slumbered beneath centuries of forgotten dust. Historians often speak of its battles, its kings, its sprawling conquests across East Asia, but rarely do they pause long enough to catch the faintest trace of something else, something not carved in stone or sealed in scrolls, something far more human, a smell. Not the scent of burning incense at ancestral altars, not the stench of blood from war, but the raw, lingering odor of living bodies, of breath, skin, sweat, and time. This is not the story of the battlefield. It is the story of the bedchamber, the bathing hut, the hidden routines of women whose names are long erased, but whose habits, if one listens closely, still whisper beneath the silence. Imagine a noble woman of Goguryeo, seated cross-legged beside a flickering oil lamp, wrapped in layers of rough fabric dyed in deep earthen tones. Her hair, thick and black, is pinned with bone combs gleaming with a residue of animal fat that has soaked into every strand. The warmth of the fire reveals not just her figure, but the accumulation of days, perhaps weeks, without bathing. Her garments layered not just for warmth, but for modesty and ritual trapped within them, a bouquet of lived-in smells, fermented herbs, damp fur, stale smoke, and the faint sting of garlic rubbed beneath her arms. To modern sensibilities, these details might provoke discomfort, even disgust, but in her world, this was normal, expected, even virtuous. Cleanliness was not judged by scent or soap, but by devotion to custom, by spiritual integrity, by survival. Water was scarce, especially warm water. Winters were punishing. Firewood was precious. To bathe was to risk illness. And so cleanliness took on other forms: prayer, incense, ritual, and silence. There are no manuals or diaries that preserve these routines, no official records detailing how a woman prepared for daily life. What remains are glimpses found in artifacts, in scattered foreign accounts, in the quiet corners of oral tradition. They tell of women who brushed their teeth with burnt twigs and rinsed with cold tea, women who pressed lard into their cheeks for a glow, who stuffed their robes with dried grass for insulation. They tell of a culture where the body was not seen as impure, but as a vessel of ancestry, duty, and endurance. It is easy to judge the past from the comfort of hot showers and perfume soaps, but perhaps judgment is not what this story asks of us. Perhaps it only asks that we listen, that we understand the weight of a time when survival came before sanitation, when a scent was not an offense but a memory, a connection, a tether to those who came before. Tonight, in the flickering shadows of this ancient kingdom, a woman we do not know bends over a basin filled with tepid water. She's warmed with her breath alone. She dips her fingers, hesitates, and then lifts the water to her face. It is not enough to cleanse, but it is enough to begin. And in that act, gentle, deliberate, sacred, we are invited to step back, to remember that history is not always clean, but it is always real, and sometimes the things we turn away from reveal the most about who we are. In the shadow of the towering mountains and the relentless winds of the north, the kingdom of Goguryeo stood vast and formidable. Between the 1st century BCE and the 7th century CE, it claimed one of the most rugged and unforgiving terrains in East Asia. Life here was not gentle. It demanded resilience from men who marched to war and from women who sustained life amid harsh winters and deep-rooted rituals. For women in Goguryeo, daily existence was shaped as much by the landscape as by custom. The climate dictated habit. Winters were long and bitter, often stretching half the year, with snow covering valleys and rivers freezing solid. Firewood was scarce. Water was locked in ice. Washing one's body was less a routine and more a calculated risk. In such a world, preservation of warmth outweighed all else, including cleanliness. Most women lived in wooden houses sealed with clay and straw low to the ground to trap warmth. Inside, smoke from the central hearth curled through the air, clinging to fabric and skin. Bathing involved laborious steps, melting snow, or fetching water from frozen wells, heating it with carefully rationed firewood, then finding a moment of privacy in crowded households. It was not done often, and when it was done minimally, more spiritual than sanitary. Societal roles were clearly defined. Women were expected to maintain the home, prepare food, weave cloth, and preserve the family's honor through obedience and ritual. But their work was not without complexity. They managed food storage, fermentation, healing herbs, and cloth layering skills essential to survival. And in the coldest seasons, they were guardians of heat, tending embers like sacred flames. Appearance, despite the physical hardship, was treated with reverence. Hair especially carried deep spiritual meaning. A woman's hair was not simply an aspect of beauty, it was an extension of her soul, her lineage. To cut it was unthinkable except in mourning. Instead, it was oiled, combed, and bound with care. They used bone combs to untangle strands, animal fats to condition them, and cloth wraps to preserve the style for weeks at a time. The scent of this world was not accidental. It was crafted, though not to please others. Rather, it was to connect with the realm of ancestors. Certain herbs, garlic, and fermented oils were applied to the skin, not for freshness, but for protection against spirits, illness, and unseen forces. To the modern nose, these mixtures might offend, but to them they formed a kind of armor, invisible yet essential. Even within the smoke-filled homes, where sweat and ash clung to skin, there was ritual. Before meals, before prayers, before sleep, women would anoint their faces with lard or ash, not just to retain moisture, but to bind themselves to seasonal cycles. The dryness of winter and the moisture of spring were reflected in what was applied to the body. Cleanliness was cyclical, natural, almost cosmic. Hygiene, therefore, was not a singular action, but a series of interwoven gestures. It was in the brushing of hair with quiet reverence, in the boiling of tea leaves for mouth rinses, in the wrapping of cloth to capture warmth and spirit. It was in the deliberate choice to endure discomfort rather than violate ancestral wisdom. Foreign records from China occasionally mention the people of Goguryeo as fierce and hardy. They remark on their simple clothing and rough manners, but also on their unity and strength. These records rarely mention women, yet through the silences, one can sense their presence, tending fires, layering garments, applying herbal salves in dim morning light. No perfumes filled these homes, no soaps lined the shelves, and yet within these constraints, women built an identity layer by layer, scent by scent, habit by habit. Their rituals were not for vanity, but for endurance. Their hygiene was not about being admired, but about surviving the unrelenting cold while honoring the invisible threads of belief that tied them to their people. In this world, a woman's body was not merely her own. It was a vessel of lineage, a bearer of tradition, a site of memory. Her breath, her hair, her skin all became part of a broader narrative. And so when she refused to bathe during the deepest frost, it was not neglect, it was faith. It was knowledge passed through generations. It was her way of existing fully within her time. Thus, in Goguryeo, hygiene was not about removal. It was about layers of warmth, of scent, of belief. To survive the icebound world, one did not strip down. One wrapped tighter physically and spiritually. And in those layers, women carried a history that no scroll ever recorded. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to slow down. Dim the lights, find a warm blanket, and allow yourself to sink gently into sleep. Let the world outside fade away. You're not rushing anywhere tonight. History will carry you. Now, before we hear the next part of this strange and fascinating tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? What city or place in the world are you curled up in right now? Type it in the comments. I read every one. And if this kind of content helps you sleep, makes you curious, or simply makes you feel less alone in the dark, consider supporting the channel with a like or subscribe. It truly means the world. Alright, let's return to Goguryeo. In the kingdom of Goguryeo, water was not a commodity, it was a privilege. Nestled among cold mountains and dense forests, the land was both abundant and restrained. Rivers coursed through the valleys in spring and summer, but in the biting grip of winter they froze into silence. Snow blanketed the rooftops and pathways, but collecting and melting it for daily use required labor fuel and time resources not always available, especially to common households. In this landscape, warm water became an elusive luxury, and the act of bathing, something taken for granted in modern times, was a rare and calculated event. To understand the hygiene habits of women in this ancient kingdom, one must first abandon the assumptions of modern cleanliness. There were no showers, no hot tubs, no scented soaps lined neatly on shelves. Instead, women relied on what they could gather, prepare, and adapt rituals shaped more by survival than sanitation. For the majority of Goguryeo's population, bathing with warm water was an ordeal. It meant fetching water from a half-frozen stream, carrying it uphill in earthen jars, then heating it over a fire fed by precious wood. Every stick burned was warmth lost for cooking or heating the home. For that reason alone, full-body bathing was often avoided, particularly during the cold months. Partial cleansing targeting hands, face, or feet was more feasible, but even then it was done quickly and sparingly. In place of water, women used earth itself. Ash from the hearth was one of the most common substitutes for washing. Fine gray dust, still slightly warm, was rubbed gently over the skin to absorb oil and odor, then brushed off with a woven cloth. It was abrasive, imperfect, but effective enough to offer a sense of renewal. In some regions, fine sand or crushed clay was used similarly. Over time, these elements became part of a cultural rhythm, less a matter of getting clean, more a method of maintaining spiritual and physical balance. Another method passed through generations involved aromatic plants and roots. Certain herbs, once dried and crushed, were believed to carry purifying properties. Mugwort, pine needles, and even fermented rice husks were gathered, ground into powder, and used to scrub the body. The scent lingered earthy, pungent, and sharp. For some, this aroma was not just tolerable but sacred. It was a signature of their lineage, their connection to soil and spirit. In wealthier households, especially among the nobility, alternatives to water took a more refined form. Women of high rank might cleanse themselves with cloths dipped in rice wine or weekly brewed herbal infusions. These were not meant to sterilize, but to tone, refresh, and perfume the body. Rice wine, mildly acidic and often infused with herbs, was thought to bring warmth to the skin and vitality to the spirit. Applied with soft cloth, it created a sensation of cleansing without actual washing, yet the scent it left behind, fermented, slightly sour, and mixed with the oils already present on the body, could grow overwhelming after several days. Such practices were not considered inadequate. On the contrary, they were embedded in ritual. A woman wiping her arms and neck with herbal water was not just freshening herself, she was communing with her ancestors, aligning her body with seasonal change, preparing her spirit for the responsibilities of family and community. The act was slow, intentional, and deeply private. Laundering clothing followed similar constraints. Garments were rarely washed during winter, especially heavy outer layers. To wash them meant unlayering, exposing oneself to cold, and using large amounts of firewood to dry them afterward. Instead, garments were aired in sunlight, dusted with herbs, or smoked gently over a low fire to refresh them. Fur-lined robes absorbed and held body odor, mingling human scent with the musk of the animal it once belonged to. In modern terms, this may seem unsanitary. In Goguryeo, it was simply the scent of life. Among the most surprising elements of these hygiene customs was the use of animal fur as a cleaning tool. Strips of soft fur, especially rabbit or deer, were used to wipe the skin, absorbing sweat and residue like a primitive towel. Unlike cloth, which was scarce and hard to clean, fur could be rinsed, dried, or even burned after repeated use. For women, such fur strips were kept in personal storage pouches, sometimes tied with small tokens or charms for protection. These were not seen as dirty items, but as extensions of the body's maintenance. The scarcity of water also gave rise to creative grooming tools. Twigs were chewed into bristles and used to scrub teeth. Thin sticks of ash or herbal resin were rubbed along the gums. Hair was combed daily, if not for cleanliness, then for ritual order. Grease and oil from the scalp were considered natural conditioners. To remove them entirely was unnecessary and in some cases undesirable. A glossy shine meant strength, fertility, and care. Even ceremonial occasions did not demand bathing in the way one might expect. Instead, women prepared themselves with a scent-layering crushed herbs under their sleeves, rubbing fragrant wood ash onto their necks, or wearing small cloth sachets infused with pine oil near their chest. These subtle details became signs of reverence and social standing. Ultimately, in Goguryeo, hygiene was not a pursuit of physical purity, but a dialogue with nature's spirit and survival. To modern eyes, these habits may appear primitive, even unpleasant, but within the constraints of geography and climate, they were practical, symbolic, and profoundly human. What is luxury to one age may be necessity in another, and what we now call unclean might once have been called sacred. In the ancient kingdom of Goguryeo, the absence of water did not mean the absence of care. It simply meant that care had taken a different shape, one born of frost fire and the will to endure. In the world of Goguryeo, hair was not simply a part of the body. It was a sacred thread woven into the identity of every woman. Long, dark, and heavy, it carried meanings far beyond appearance. It was an emblem of continuity, of ancestral connection, of inner balance. To understand the hygiene practices of Goguryeo women, one must begin with their hair, not as a detail, but as a center of cultural gravity. Hair was rarely cut. For many, it was never cut at all, except in moments of deep grief or mourning. To remove one's hair was to break a spiritual link, to sever a connection with the generations that came before. Even the mere act of trimming a strand was approached with hesitation, if not outright avoidance. A woman's hair was seen as a vessel of memory, energy, and essence. It was not to be altered lightly, and certainly not to be handled by just anyone. Only a few people, usually close female relatives, were permitted to touch a woman's hair. In many households, this task fell upon the woman herself. Daily, she would sit beside a low fire or under dim daylight, unwrapping the cloth that bound her hair, slowly letting the weight fall behind her shoulders. The air would fill with the scent of animal fat, pine ash, and old fabric. Not unpleasant to her, it was familiar, grounding, and ceremonial. Before combing, she would apply a thin layer of rendered fat, often from deer or boar, into her palms. This fat served not just to tame the strands or provide sheen, but to preserve the hair during long weeks without washing. It coated the shafts, protected them from cold, and locked in heat and scent. The smell of this fat, once warmed by the scalp, mingled with the natural oils of the body and the ambient smoke of the hearth. Over time, it became a signature, a personal, intimate presence. Combing was deliberate. Using carved bone combs or wooden tools passed through generations, the woman would move with slow meditative strokes. The act itself could take half an hour or more, especially for those with thick hair. Tangles were met with patience, not frustration. Knots were untied like knots of fate, carefully without haste, and always alone or in the company of trusted kin. Once combed, the hair was not left to flow. That was reserved for private moments. In daily life, it was braided, coiled, or wrapped tightly around the crown, then bound with strips of cloth or tucked under a head covering. These wrappings, once tied, would remain in place for days, even weeks. Not to be removed without purpose, they gathered the smells of living fire, food, sweat, and silence. To outsiders, such practices might seem unclean, but within the framework of Goguryeo life, they were considered essential. Cleanliness was not measured by frequency of washing, but by harmony with one's surroundings. The hair was not to be stripped of its oils or its scent. Rather, it was to be nourished, preserved, and respected as a symbol of endurance and belonging. In colder months, these coverings became more important than ever. They insulated the head, retained warmth, and shielded the hair from snow and dampness. Women took great care to dry their hair fully before rewrapping it, a task difficult in winter, often requiring hours near the fire. Washing the hair itself was rare, often done only with herbal rinses during warmer seasons. Water and ash were mixed with crushed mugwort or pine resin, creating a cleansing infusion that was poured slowly through the strands. The result was not a modern luster, but a resilient shine earned and embedded. The symbolism of hair extended into ritual and status. Unmarried women often wore their hair long and unbound at home, signaling their availability for marriage. Married women, however, kept their hair tightly bound, signaling commitment and spiritual enclosure. On festival days or during rites of passage, women might unbraid their hair ceremonially, then retie it as part of transformation. These acts were not performances. They were deeply personal, encoded gestures within a language understood by the community. Even illness was sometimes read through the hair. Dull strands were seen as signs of imbalance of internal coldness or spiritual unrest. Conversely, thick and well-maintained hair was admired, believed to reflect a woman's discipline, her connection to the earth, and the health of her household. To lose hair was to lose vitality, something that invoked quiet concern and sacred remedy. Some women stored strands of their fallen hair in small pouches, keeping them for ritual use or burial preparation. Others offered them during ancestor ceremonies, burning them with incense or weaving them into ceremonial cloth. The hair, even in its absence from the head, retained power. This reverence shaped hygiene in profound ways. Hair was not something to clean, but something to tend to, hold to, honor. Its scent was not offensive, it was lived in. Its weight was not burdensome, it was legacy. And its maintenance was not for display, it was for survival, both physical and spiritual. In the unseen corners of Goguryeo homes, by flickering firelight, countless women cared for their hair in silence. Each stroke of the comb was an act of memory. Each wrapping of the cloth was a binding of identity. In their stillness, they wove something larger than style, something sacred. In modern terms, much of this may be difficult to comprehend, but for them, it was life. To touch the hair was to touch a history. To leave it untouched was to protect that history. And to carry its scent was to carry the weight of generations woven not just into strands but into the soul. In the ancient kingdom of Goguryeo, body odor was not necessarily a mark of shame. To the women of this rugged, mountainous realm, scent was a part of life, an extension of presence, ancestry, and belief. Unlike modern ideals of hygiene, which center on the removal of smell, Goguryeo traditions embraced odor as something meaningful. It was not merely tolerated, it was protected. Among the beliefs passed down through generations was the notion that one's natural scent connected them to their ancestors. A person's smell shaped by the oils of their skin, the smoke from the hearth, the herbs they handled, and the food they consumed became a kind of spiritual fingerprint. It was said that those who carried a strong, persistent body scent retained a closeness to their lineage, almost as if the presence of the ancestors could be sensed through the air around them. For this reason, the deliberate use of fragrance was approached with caution. Perfuming the body was not considered appropriate for daily life. In fact, many women avoided floral or sweet aromas altogether. It was believed that such scents might obscure the natural signature of the soul, potentially confusing ancestral spirits or breaking protective bonds. The idea of keeping the spirit intact was literal scent was a tether between realms. Instead of deodorants or oils, women in Goguryeo turned to materials they believed would purify or protect. Crushed garlic was a favorite, particularly when rubbed under the arms or behind the ears. Its pungent strength was thought to ward off illness, bad fortune, and unwelcome spiritual interference. However, mixed with layers of unwashed fabric and the natural oils of the body, garlic became one note in a complex symphony of smells that followed a person wherever they went. Bokeh or soapberry was another commonly used substance. When boiled and ground into a paste, it produced a mildly cleansing lather, but its primary value was not in cleaning. It was used in hair treatments or as a symbolic scrub believed to carry away negative energy. The scent it left behind, earthy, nutty, sharp, added yet another layer to the bodily aroma of Goguryeo women. Fur-lined robes worn for warmth and rarely washed trapped scents over time. The musk of animal hide, human sweat herbs tucked into inner pockets, and the smoky traces of open fire created a smell that could not be described in simple terms. It was layered, evolving, deeply personal. These were not odors of neglect, but markers of survival and spiritual alignment. The practice of not masking one's body scent was rooted in a worldview where one's essence needed to be known, not concealed. In a community-oriented society where lineage was paramount, a person's scent became as recognizable as a face or a voice. Within households and tribes, this was a comfort. It was continuity. But to outsiders, it could be overwhelming. Chinese emissaries and scribes who visited Goguryeo recorded such experiences in sparse but telling observations. Some remarked that noble women of the court, though dignified and regal, bore an intensity of presence that was difficult to ignore. Others described the interiors of Goguryeo dwellings as thick with air, a place where garment, skin, and breath carried layers of life too intimate to approach casually. Though never outright condemning, the tone was clear. There was a cultural barrier that went beyond language. One visitor from the southern dynasties noted in his record that the women of their court dressed finely but bathed sparingly. Their bodies carry the scent of forest and smoke, and they speak in quiet tones. To sit beside them is to enter a world not ours. In that brief description lies a truth, what some might call odor, others experienced as atmosphere. The women of Goguryeo did not hide themselves in fragrance, nor did they seek to erase the marks of their daily existence. Instead, they chose to live in harmony with the cycles of their bodies and their land. During the coldest months, scent was often intensified heat, trapped under layers, moisture absent from the air, bathing nearly impossible. Yet they believed that to carry their scent proudly was to show strength. It was proof of endurance of life continuing through hardship. Rituals centered around scent were not uncommon. Before a festival or a household rite, women might lightly smoke their clothing over pine branches, not to deodorize, but to offer the smoke as a gesture of blessing. They might rub their wrists with ash or wear small pouches of dried herbs, not to smell pleasant, but to invite protection or ward off spiritual intrusion. These were acts of reverence, not vanity. Even intimate relationships were shaped by these beliefs. Scent was a form of closeness. It was not uncommon for a woman's partner to recognize her not only by her voice or presence, but by the very specific scent she carried, one shaped by weeks of lived in fabric, her choice of herbs, her diet, her daily movements. This scent, so deeply personal, became part of memory, desire, and bond. Cleanliness then was redefined. It was not an absence of smell, but an alignment of sense. It was a body that reflected its world, its duties, its spiritual place. To cleanse was not to strip away, but to honor the layers. And so women of Goguryeo did not cleanse in the way modernity might understand. They tended, they preserved, they carried. Their scent was the scent of fire, and earth of garlic, and pine of ash, and oil of human life woven into ritual. It was not made to appeal to others. It was made to endure, to remember, to protect. In that scent lived the story of their people unwritten, but always present, lingering in fabric, in hair, in breath. And long after they were gone, it remained like a voice in a cold mountain wind, reminding those who followed that they once lived fully without shame, and entirely on their own terms. In the cold and wind-bitten world of the Goguryeo kingdom, the care of skin was not merely a matter of appearance. It was a ritual of preservation, a dialogue between survival and belief. The air was dry, the winters brutal, and the sun, though weak, could crack the skin like dried bark. In such conditions, women turned to what the land could offer: animal fat, tree sap, eggs, herbs, each blended, layered, and pressed into the skin with purpose. Foremost among these was deer fat, prized for its warmth and thickness. Rendered from the bones and flesh of the animal, it was melted into a dense salve and stored in sealed containers near the hearth. In the early mornings or before sleep, women would dip their fingers into this balm and apply it across their cheeks, foreheads, and hands. The scent was strong, raw, earthy, unmistakably animal, but the sensation it left was one of insulation, like sealing the skin against the hostile world outside. It prevented cracking, held in body heat, and in the minds of those who used it, offered protection not only from the elements, but also from spirits that thrived in the cold. Egg whites, though rarer in daily use, were cherished for different reasons. When available, they were carefully separated and whipped into a light froth, then spread across the face like a film. As it dried, the mask tightened, drawing the skin beneath it into firmness. To Goguryeo, women, this sensation was not discomfort but discipline, the tightening of the flesh, seen as a reflection of moral and spiritual restraint. For special occasions, or during rites of passage, egg white masks became part of preparation, acts of devotion made visible through the skin. More curious and more symbolic still was the use of tree resin. Tapped from living trunks and mixed with dry blood, usually from small animals or self-inflicted pinpricks, this concoction was believed to carry vitality. It was not applied daily nor openly discussed, but in hushed corners of certain households, women would blend the resin until it thickened, then dab it along their cheeks or collarbones. The mixture darkened upon drying, leaving a faint reddish hue on the skin. This hue, though unnatural, was considered a blessing, evidence that life coursed close to the surface, that the body held strength and spirit. Bee-derived substances such as raw honey or beeswax also found their place in skin rituals. Wax was softened and rubbed into cracked lips or the space between fingers, while honey, when warmed, was smoothed over blemishes. Sticky and fragrant, it was used not for sweetness, but for purification. In a culture where bathing was rare and steam was sacred, the use of sticky binding materials was not counterintuitive, it was transformative. A woman emerging from such treatment did not seek praise for smoothness, she sought balance, restoration. Of course, these rituals had consequences. The frequent layering of animal-based substances without proper cleansing led to blocked pores, chronic irritation, and in some cases, the eruption of painful cysts. But these were not viewed as ailments to be hidden or shamed. On the contrary, they were sometimes interpreted as a form of cleansing, an outward purging of inner imbalance. The skin, as the body's most visible boundary, was seen as a surface upon which both sins and strength could be revealed. A woman with redness or swelling was not mocked. She was seen perhaps as someone undergoing renewal. The process of applying these treatments was often meditative. Women would sit near a fire using their own fingers or smooth stones to spread the mixture across their faces and arms. There were no mirrors. Instead, the feeling of the fingertips, the sound of crackling wood, the rhythm of breath guided the ritual. Silence accompanied most of these moments, not because the act was shameful, but because it was sacred. No part of this care was commercial. Nothing was bought. Everything was sourced, gathered, traded, or created within the bounds of the home and forest. Ingredients were seasonal, and rituals shifted with them. In spring, more herbs. In winter, more fat. During illness, certain roots were added. During mourning, certain mixtures were forbidden. The skin became not just a reflection of health, but a seasonal journal responding to life, death, joy, fatigue. To modern eyes, the idea of smearing blood-tinted resin or sealing the face with fat may seem shocking, even repulsive. But in the Goguryeo worldview, these acts were declarations. They said, I endure. They said, I remember. They turned the body into a site of continuity, a place where nature and history met beneath the skin. And so the women of Goguryeo did not exfoliate or tone in the modern sense. They layered. They infused. They honored the skin as a threshold between worlds, between cold and warmth, between seen and unseen. Their beauty was not in glow or smoothness, but in resilience. In the ancient Goguryeo kingdom, long before the invention of toothbrushes or the widespread concept of oral hygiene, the care of the mouth was governed by tradition, adaptation, and necessity. Teeth were not scrubbed with bristles or rinsed with antiseptics. Instead, women turned to the natural world, to the bark of trees, the chewable twigs of soft branches, and the resin that dripped like honey from pine. One of the most common practices involved the use of twigs from specific trees, often willow birch or other flexible varieties. These twigs were chewed at one end until the fibers separated into a brush-like texture. With gentle pressure, the soft end would be rubbed along the teeth and gums. It was not a vigorous scrubbing, but rather a symbolic gesture of cleansing. Sometimes dipped in salt or ash, these twig brushes absorbed the taste of earth and sap. The sensation was gritty, the flavor bitter, but the method was passed from woman to woman, generation to generation, with solemn consistency. For those without access to proper twigs, the bark of young trees was scraped and softened, then rubbed between the teeth or across the tongue. Some women believed certain barks, especially from persimmon or cherry, had purifying qualities. The taste, though sharp and occasionally numbing, was accepted as part of the process. There was no expectation of sweetness, no minty freshness. Instead, there was a stoic belief in function over comfort. Another curious practice was the chewing of pine resin. Gathered in small lumps from wounded trees, this amber-colored substance was hard at first but softened in the mouth. As it warmed, it released a pungent scent that coated the tongue and teeth. The resin was thought to seal small cuts inside the mouth and freshen the breath in a spiritual sense. However, over time, the buildup of sticky residue did little to remove debris. Still, the act of chewing itself was considered a form of oral exercise, promoting strength in the jaw and discipline in habit. Among the nobility, more elaborate substances found their way into hygiene routines. Some women crushed charcoal into fine powder and mixed it with sea salt or dried herbs. This blackened mixture was dabbed onto cloth and gently pressed onto the teeth. The result was often darkened enamel, but in the context of Goguryeo aesthetics, the color of teeth mattered far less than the act of maintaining ritual. Blackened or gray teeth were sometimes even praised for their association with age wisdom and natural alignment. Mouth rinsing, as understood today, was virtually unknown. Water was precious and rarely wasted for internal cleaning. Instead, after a cleaning ritual, the mouth was wiped dry with strips of linen or rabbit fur. These fabrics were stored near the fire to remain soft, then pressed along the gums or tongue to remove excess residue. The wiping was not merely physical, it was spiritual, removing unseen energies, clearing the path for proper speech and breath. But even with these efforts, the reality remained stark. Breath was rarely fresh by modern standards. In fact, contemporary Chinese emissaries once described the scent of Goguryeo noblewomen as stronger than summer wine left under the sun. This wasn't meant solely as insult, it was an observation of cultural contrast. In Goguryeo, breath was believed to carry the soul's condition. A strong scent meant the body was alive, active in contact with the ancestors. Mild or scentless breath, by contrast, was associated with illness or detachment. As such, some women deliberately avoided strong smelling herbs or rinses. They believed that scentless breath was spiritually hollow. Instead, they embraced the use of garlic mustard seeds and fermented paste to amplify their oral scent. This practice, while confusing to outsiders, made perfect sense within the framework of Goguryeo spiritual hygiene. The body should not be neutral, it should speak, emit, declare. The use of aromatic roots such as angelica or wild ginger was also common. These were chewed slowly, allowing their juices to mix with saliva and coat the inner mouth. Unlike modern breath fresheners, these roots were valued more for their medicinal symbolism than their actual fragrance. To chew angelica root before speaking with elders was an act of reverence, as if aligning one's breath with the sacred. The overall oral routine was slow, deliberate, and deeply ritualistic. There were no timers, no routines bound to morning and night. Instead, cleaning rituals were often tied to specific days, after certain meals, before prayers, or during changes of season. A woman might sit in silence at dusk, chewing bark not to clean, but to listen to herself, to her ancestors, to the earth beneath her feet. The absence of dental tools did have long-term effects. Teeth wore down unevenly, gums sometimes became inflamed, and decay was often left untreated. Yet none of these outcomes was considered shameful. Teeth were not part of vanity, but of purpose. A mouth was judged more for what it said and whom it honored than how it smelled. The notion of hygiene in Goguryeo cannot be separated from belief. The body was a vessel, yes, but it was also a messenger. To scrub too clean was to erase one's spiritual history. To mask all scent was to reject one's past. And so they preserved not just the body, but the memories within it, the smells of their homes, the roots of their trees, and the ash of their fires. This was not a world of mint and sparkle. It was a world of bark, smoke, resin, and breath. A world where women shaped their identity not with toothpaste, but with patience. In the Goguryeo kingdom, where rituals governed daily life, and the line between the physical and spiritual was constantly negotiated, the subject of menstruation lived in the shadows. It was not spoken of in public nor detailed in records. It passed each month in silence, wrapped in custom, fear, and a complex sense of sacredness. For women, it was a time of endurance, both physical and spiritual. There were no manufactured solutions, no cotton, no sterile fabrics. What they used came from the earth and from the labor of their hands. Strips of coarse cloth were sewn or folded to form makeshift pads. Some were old garments, others specially set aside for this purpose. The material was rough, not designed for comfort, but for necessity. The cloth was reused, rarely washed with water, and often left out in the sun, or passed through smoke to cleanse it. In the cold winds of Goguryeo, water was reserved for drinking, cooking, or sacred bathing. It was not wasted on what was believed to be untouchable. Instead of rinsing, women turned to fire and air. Soiled cloths were hung near the hearth where smoke curled around them like invisible fingers, or they were draped on branches under the sun, hidden from view, yet always vulnerable to whispers. Sunlight, it was believed, had the power to purify not only cloth but spirit. Smoke too was sacred. It carried prayers upward. When used in this context, it was not seen as avoidance of cleanliness, but a spiritual substitution. Leaves and dry grass played a role as well. In times when cloth was scarce, women would line their garments with layers of clean leaves, usually broad, soft varieties or carefully dried grass bundles. These absorbed what they could and were burned afterward. Fire once again erased evidence, but not the discomfort. There was chafing, there was risk, and there was pain, but also silence. No one complained aloud. To do so would draw attention to what was considered taboo. Among some families, there existed a belief that water must never touch menstrual blood. To do so, they said, would invite misfortune, weaken the spirit, or even disrupt the household's flow of luck. For this reason, many women avoided bathing during this time. Instead, they would stand near smoke or carry smoldering herbs in small bowls, letting the vapors surround their lower body. This practice, seen today as mystifying, was their version of purification, a substitute for water, a shield from harm. No special space was reserved for this part of a woman's life. There were no sanctuaries, no rest periods. Women continued their daily tasks, their hands still grinding, lifting, cooking, tending to fire. And when they felt weak, they carried that weight in silence. Because among some, any sign of fatigue during this time was seen not as illness, but as an omen, a bad harvest, a failed hunt, a restless ancestor. And so women endured behind closed lips, folding their pain into their breath and pressing forward as if untouched. There are records from neighboring regions, particularly from Chinese visitors and scribes, who noted a peculiar quietness around Goguryeo women during certain days of the month. The observers did not understand, but they sensed the shift, a dimming of energy a certain distance. What they could not see was a storm beneath that silence. The social codes that bound these women were as tight as the cloth they wrapped around themselves. There were two old beliefs passed down in whispers: that a woman during this time held great spiritual sensitivity, that her presence could invite unwanted spirits or disrupt rituals if she entered certain sacred grounds. Because of this, some women chose to withdraw temporarily to sitting apart during meals, avoiding certain ceremonies. Others kept amulets in their garments to lock their energy, believing it would contain whatever might disturb the spiritual balance of the home. This sense of hidden power came with cost. Illnesses, cramps, fevers, weakness were not discussed. They were endured. A woman in pain was advised to remain quiet, for to admit discomfort was to bring dirty winds into the house. Pain was not seen as something to relieve, but something to pass through, like a shadow across the sun. In some households, elder women would prepare herbal bundles, sage, mugwort, pine needles, and burn them gently in corners of the house. The smoke, curling in silent spirals, was believed to ease inner heat and absorb heavy energy. The woman experiencing her cycle would sit nearby, eyes closed, breathing deeply. No words were spoken. This was not medicine, but ritual, a form of energetic alignment. There was no community around this experience. It was solitary, hidden, sacred. It was not taught with charts or anatomy, but with gesture and tone. Girls learned from mothers, aunts, or older sisters through folded cloth, through fire smoke, through long silences held together. No questions, only watching and remembering. And yet, for all the weight of taboo, there was also strength, a quiet strength born from survival, from ritual, from knowing the rhythm of one's own body and walking through it without applause, without comfort, without words. The women of Goguryeo did not speak of these days, but they passed them one by one, holding themselves through pain, belief, and earth-born wisdom. In a world without soap or privacy, without medical care or freedom to rest, the management of menstruation was not a hygienic task, it was a spiritual endurance. It shaped the way women moved, sat, breathed. It shaped how they were seen and unseen. The silence was not emptiness, it was a legacy. In the world of Goguryeo, where the seasons were harsh and traditions carved the rules of living, the idea of personal hygiene within marriage followed an entirely different logic than what modern sensibilities might expect. Cleanliness, in the way contemporary societies understand it, was not a virtue. In fact, in many communities of Goguryeo, excessive cleanliness was seen as suspicious, a mark of vanity, or worse, of spiritual disconnection. As two individuals entered into marriage, they brought with them the full expression of their lived bodies, and this included scent deep layered unmasked. The union was not of polished skin or scented oils, but of survival ritual and a raw kind of honesty. For women, preparing for the first night with a husband did not involve soap or perfume. Instead, there existed a tradition of wrapping crushed garlic in pieces of cloth and tucking them beneath the robes. Garlic was believed to have protective properties not only against illness but also against misfortune or unwanted spirits. Its pungent aroma was not considered offensive. On the contrary, it was a kind of natural armor. The scent followed them through the night like a veil, thick and grounding. Men had their own preparations. A common practice involved sprinkling fragrant ash created from burning pine or mugwort into their hair. The particles clung to the strands, giving the hair a smoky fragrance that mingled with the natural oils of an unwashed scalp. This was not intended to mask odor, but to align the body with fire and earth. The scent of pine and sweat blended into a new culturally accepted form of presence. In such a setting, bodily smell was not only tolerated, it was a form of identity. Couples could recognize each other not just by sight or voice, but by scent. This olfactory fingerprint was shaped by the foods they ate, the herbs they carried, the smoke they sat beside, and the rituals they performed. The scent was never artificial. It was real. It was earned. Among elders, there was a saying passed quietly: the body must speak before the mouth. It meant that one's physical presence, the warmth, the scent, the breath should announce one's spirit. This belief made deodorizing unnecessary. A scentless body was a body in hiding. It lacked truth. It lacked story. This belief extended deep into marriage. There are oral accounts that speak of couples who lived together for years without ever bathing together or even discussing the concept. Bathing, when done at all, was private and infrequent. The notion of shared bathing as intimacy simply did not exist. In fact, to suggest it might have been seen as irreverent, even absurd. The body was not something to be purified for a partner, but something to be accepted in its natural state. What is even more startling to modern ears is how long some couples went without bathing at all. Seasonal rituals may have included washing in rivers or wiping down with herbal brews, but these were exceptional events. For many, daily or even monthly cleansing with water was a luxury. Some records suggest that couples went years, 3 or more, without ever bathing together or witnessing each other do so. It was not a lack of intimacy, but rather a shared acceptance of bodily truth. Bathing was seen as something closer to spiritual rebirth than physical hygiene. To overdo it would suggest a detachment from the ancestral way. The environment of Goguryeo only reinforced this outlook. Winters were long and punishing. Heating water was laborious. Rivers froze. Firewood was precious. Under such circumstances, wiping with cloth or fur, applying smoke or ash, or simply enduring the scent of one's own body was not laziness, it was adaptation. Importantly, within the cultural framework of the time, smelling like yourself was not a cause for shame. In fact, some believed that those who smelled too clean had severed ties with the earth, they had washed away their protection. they had made themselves vulnerable. The scent of sweat, smoke, fermented oils, or garlic was not only normal, it was necessary. When two people met in marriage, what met was not just flesh, but the residue of lineage, what clung to the skin after years of fireside meals, of herbal compresses, of winter nights wrapped in furs. The scent they carried was not a flaw, it was a badge. In this world, to love someone meant to share not just a home, but a history embedded in the skin. It was to accept the language of sweat and ash, to breathe in not perfume but persistence. In the ancient Goguryeo kingdom, the act of grooming was not simply a matter of cleanliness. It was a ritual deeply embedded in culture, spirit, and identity. Hair was more than strands that grew from the scalp. It was believed to be a bridge between the living body and the unseen world. And so every act related to the hair combing, tying, covering was laden with meaning. Women in Goguryeo rarely used combs made of polished materials. Instead, they turned to carved wood and animal bone. The most prized combs were fashioned from the ribs of deer or oxen, polished smooth by hand, and sometimes inscribed with symbols of protection. These combs were not mass produced. Each one carried a personal touch, a story. Some were passed down as heirlooms, believed to retain the energy of those who used them before. The grooming cloth they used were equally humble. Woven from coarse fibers or animal threads, they were not washed after each use. In fact, it was common for a woman to use the same grooming cloth throughout an entire season. The cloth became stiff-stained and heavily scented, carrying with it the smells of smoke, sweat, and time. But this was not considered repulsive. On the contrary, it was believed that the cloth absorbed part of her essence and thus should not be washed away so casually. The act of combing one's hair was deliberate and slow. A typical session could last 2 to 3 hours, depending on the length and thickness of the hair. Women would sit on the ground near a fire or under daylight legs, folded hair unwrapped. There was no rushing. Each stroke of the comb was thought to awaken the senses, clear the mind, and realign the spiritual threads of the body. Sometimes this combing was done alone, sometimes with another woman. A mother, a sister, or a close elder might be the one to guide the comb through the tangles, whispering quiet chants or humming forgotten melodies. In these moments, the act transcended grooming. It became communion. In certain seasons, especially around the time of ancestral rituals, combing the hair was done as part of a larger ceremonial process. Before honoring the ancestors, a woman might spend the entire morning cleansing her mind through the repetition of hair brushing, not with water, not with oils, but with breath and rhythm. To comb the hair was to untangle confusion, to smooth out misfortune, and to prepare the soul to be seen. The tools used were not pristine. The bone combs often had residue built between the teeth, bits of oil, flakes of skin, strands of hair, but cleaning the comb too thoroughly was discouraged. It was said that stripping it of all traces would also strip the spirit's connection. Similarly, the grooming cloth was never scrubbed clean. It was aired out in smoke or sunlight, but rarely touched water. To wash it too much was to erase the memory it carried. There were even moments when hair combing formed part of mourning or healing rituals. A woman grieving the loss of a family member might comb her hair in silence for days, each stroke a form of meditation. During illness, the hair was combed with caution, believed to draw out bad energy. And during times of change, marriage, childbirth, or spiritual transition, special combs were used only once, then burned or buried. What seems peculiar to modern minds is how little emphasis was placed on the goal of cleanliness. Tangled hair was not shameful. Scented hair, even with sweat or oils, was not seen as improper. What mattered was the intention. To comb was to ground the self, to offer respect to the ancestors, and to express one's rhythm in life. A woman with well-combed hair was not simply tidy, she was spiritually aligned. In the Goguryeo worldview, hair was the highest point on the body. It reached toward the heavens. To ignore it was to fall out of harmony. To tend to it was to call balance back into being. So each comb stroke was sacred. Each strand was memory. There was no perfume, no shampoo, no mirror, only the comb, the cloth, the time, and the belief that something invisible passed through the hair each time the comb passed through it. In the spiritual worldview of Goguryeo, where every element of daily life was entangled with ritual and meaning, scent was never merely biological, it was a channel to the sacred. Odor, especially the strong and persistent kind, played a paradoxical role. What might seem offensive to modern noses was to them a symbol of purity, loyalty, and ancestral alignment. For women, this belief shaped not only their grooming habits but their standing within the community. The smell of sweat smoke, old cloth, or fermented animal fat was not something to be hidden or neutralized. Instead, it was cultivated and protected. A woman's scent was considered part of her essence, and that essence had deep spiritual resonance. To strip it away through washing or perfume was in some views to strip away her power. There were even ceremonies where smell took center stage. One of the more astonishing practices involved the burning of animal fat, often rancid or aged intentionally as an offering to the ancestors. The rising smoke, thick and greasy, was believed to carry human prayers to the spirit world. Women were often responsible for preparing and maintaining these fires. The smell that clung to their skin, their hair, and their robes afterward was not a stain, it was a blessing. It marked them as participants in a sacred exchange. Cleanliness in the modern sense was often treated with suspicion. A woman who smelled too fresh, whose clothes were unsoiled, whose breath carried no smoke or herb could be perceived as spiritually hollow, or worse, as someone who had something to hide. There are tales whispered from one hearth to another of women accused of witchcraft, not because of strange behavior, but because of the absence of scent. To carry no odor was to stand apart from the human world, to defy nature, and possibly to consort with unseen forces. The physical environment reinforced these customs. With long winters and limited access to clean water, frequent washing was not only impractical, it was discouraged. Smoke from animal fat and dried herbs replaced water-based cleansing. Women would deliberately expose themselves to these smokes, letting it settle on their garments and skin. They saw this not as filth, but as a kind of protection, a spiritual buffer between their bodies and the harsh, unpredictable world beyond the home. This philosophy even extended to how women perceived illness. It was believed that certain sicknesses were caused not by bacteria or imbalance, but by too much cleanliness, which weakened the body's natural defenses and disconnected the soul from ancestral memory. The stronger the odor, the stronger the tether to one's lineage. Marriage rituals, too, were affected by this worldview. A bride's scent on her wedding day was meant to reflect her readiness, not her hygiene. Layers of smoke, animal oils, and herbal compresses were applied with care. The resulting aroma was complex, earthy, and powerful. It was meant to be overwhelming, not delicate. Her scent declared her alive, tied to the land, and guided by tradition. This reverence for natural odor did not mean that women ignored grooming entirely. They still combed their hair with precision, rubbed their skin with herbal powders, and maintained seasonal rituals. But these acts were not aimed at erasing scent. They enhanced it, added meaning, or directed it towards sacred intentions. The body was a vessel, not something to sanitize, but something to prepare for the invisible world. To an outsider, stepping into a Goguryeo home during ritual time might have been a sensory shock. The air would be thick with the smell of smoke, fermented oils, dried roots, and living bodies. But to those inside, this was the smell of safety, of continuity, of belief. Women bore this scent proudly. It clung to them as they cooked, worked, and performed rites. They knew it spoke louder than words. It announced their presence in both this life and the one beyond. In the kingdom of Goguryeo, the most sacred women were not the cleanest by modern standards. They were the ones whose scent told a story of earth and spirit, fire and fat, silence and ceremony. From the eyes of neighboring kingdoms, the women of Goguryeo were both bewildering and formidable. Across centuries, diplomats, envoys, and travelers from the Sui tongue and northern tribes recorded their encounters not only in terms of trade or politics, but in terms of scent, demeanor, and presence. It was not uncommon for scribes to mention how hard it was to remain composed in the presence of Goguryeo women whose appearance defied southern customs and whose aura left a mark deeper than any exchange of words. Reports from Sui emissaries describe the women of Goguryeo as restrained and disciplined. One noted that they moved like wind against rock, silent but never soft. They rarely smiled at foreigners, rarely lowered their gaze, and often observed strangers with an intensity that unsettled even the most seasoned court officials. But what the writers seemed most fixated on was the smell. They mentioned thick layers of clothing that carried a persistent aroma of smoke, sweat, and animal oils. To those raised in the perfumed halls of the Chinese courts, this was an affront, yet none dared insult it openly. The Tang scribes wrote in greater detail. A particular document preserved in imperial records describes an audience with a Goguryeo delegation where one woman among the group stood out not because of her attire, which was coarse and heavy, nor because of her voice, which was low and steady, but because of the way the air shifted around her. She wore no powder. The account reads no perfume, yet all were forced to notice her. Her scent was sharp, bitter as the fat from burnt marrow, but her eyes held the stillness of someone who does not fear storms. That scribe admitted that while the smell was jarring, it gave her a presence that none could challenge. Even the nomads of the north tribes familiar with harsh climates and rigorous lives regarded the women of Goguryeo with mixed awe and discomfort. The Mobe, who lived in the steppes and shared more similarities with the Goguryeo people than the Chinese courts did, respected the endurance of these women. They noted how the women did not complain during long marches, how they carried firewood and water without ceremony, and how they sat by the flames with faces calm and clothes deeply scented. To them, the odor was a mark of resilience, not disgrace. But within all these records, there was a common thread. Those who met Goguryeo women never forgot them. Their smell, though foreign and overpowering, became part of their legend. In some whispers, they were said to carry spirits with them, unwashed, unperfumed, but watched over by the ancestors. Their uncleanliness, by foreign standards, was viewed as a sign of inner clarity and unshakable will. The women of Goguryeo did not seek to please the outsiders. They did not soften their habits for diplomacy, and in doing so they commanded fear and respect. Their scent announced them before they spoke. Their silence held more weight than flattery, and their refusal to conform made them a mystery wrapped in strength, ritually potent, socially untouchable. To the kingdoms around them, Goguryeo women were not beautiful in the delicate sense. They were something else entirely intimidating, spiritual, unforgettable. As the twilight of Goguryeo approached, the weight of centuries-old traditions began to fracture under the pressure of war, famine, and the ever-encroaching forces from both Tang and Silla. The kingdom, once proud and unbending, slowly began to unravel, and with it the deeply rooted hygiene rituals of its women faded into obscurity, not through rejection, but through the slow erosion of time and survival. The final decades of Goguryeo were marked by desperation. Fortresses that once echoed with ritual chants fell silent. Hearths, once used for burning fat and drying ceremonial cloths, turned cold. The women who had, for generations, worn their scent as a symbol of strength and spirituality began to abandon the practices, not because they doubted them, but because the world around them no longer had room for them. Survival meant adaptation. In cities like Pyongyang, where courtly traditions once upheld the honor of unwashed hair and animal-scented cloth, new influences began to creep in. Silla emissaries brought with them ideas of cleanliness, tied to aesthetics rather than spirituality. Tang philosophies emphasized refinement, fragrance, and order. Women who once braided their hair with deer tallow and pine soot now began to hide the scent. It was not a decision born of shame, but of necessity. To be marked by old customs was to be marked as old Goguryeo, an identity quickly becoming dangerous. Whispers started to grow. Those who still carried the smell of fermented fat in their headscarves were no longer seen as spiritual. They were viewed as remnants of a vanishing world, strange, stubborn, perhaps even backward. Younger generations began to look away. Markets started to sell imported perfumes. Soap like herbs from Silla found their way into the homes of former noble families. The rituals once performed under moonlight in quiet reverence to ancestors were now hurried or forgotten altogether, and yet not all disappeared. In remote villages, far from the crumbling palaces and shifting borders, some women clung to their ways. They lit fat-fueled lamps, they combed their hair with bone, they whispered over old cloth. They knew that the kingdom might fall, but spirit could survive in silence. Even as they were called relics, even as they were shunned, they carried their traditions like flame in a closed hand. Centuries later, some of those rituals would resurface not in the same form but as echoes. The Korean sauna, with its focus on body rituals and inherited wellness, the herbal treatments passed through generations, the careful braiding of hair for ancestral rites. These are not direct continuations, but faint shadows. Yet in those shadows, the scent of Goguryeo still lingers, faint, forgotten, but never fully erased. To history, the fall of Goguryeo was a political collapse, but to its women, it was the slow extinguishing of a sacred language, one told through cloth, smoke, and scent. Their silence was not surrender. It was a burial of memory, waiting for someone to unearth it. Imagine someone from today placed gently but unprepared into the heart of ancient Goguryeo, not as a guest, not as a ruler, but as an ordinary woman expected to wake before dawn, to fetch water from a half-frozen stream, to wrap her hair not with shampoo and silk, but with cloth steeped in smoke and deer tallow. How long before the discomfort becomes unbearable? A day without bathing. 2. By day 3, the body rebels. By day 4, the mind begins to search for logic. By day 5, perhaps the soul begins to adapt. The customs of Goguryeo were not chosen for luxury. They were born from climate isolation, scarcity, and belief. A woman did not bathe every day because there was no warm water to spare. She did not wear perfume because it was believed to attract restless spirits. Instead, she rubbed crushed garlic behind her ears, not for flavor, but for spiritual clarity. She chewed resin not for breath freshening, but to protect her voice. She endured layers of smoke, animal fat, and fermented herbal mixtures, not because she wanted to, but because it was what women did to be clean, according to the world they inherited. A modern visitor used to hot water at the twist of a handle and the hum of scented air fresheners would likely struggle. The texture of raw cloth against unwashed skin, the cloying smell of wool left in rain worn day after day, the weight of hair that hasn't seen water in a week, and more than the physical challenges, the judgment from within, because what she perceives as unclean was once considered sacred. In Goguryeo, dirt was not disgrace. Scent was not shame. Cleanliness did not mean removal, but balance. To scrub away all trace of smell would be to scrub away identity. To look too neat might invite suspicion. There are records of those who smelled too sweet being accused of deceit, or worse, of sorcery. It is believed that too much effort to change one's natural state meant trying to hide something from the ancestors. So how long could a person from the 21st century survive in such conditions? Would she last 7 days without bathing? Could she go a week without soap, without brushing her teeth, without touching dry shampoo or deodorant? Could she accept that her scent was no longer just hers, but a message to the spirit world? It is easy to judge from a distance, to wrinkle the nose, to say disgusting, to laugh, But every ritual, every odd habit was once a solution shaped by need, by cold, by belief. They were not created to horrify the future. They were crafted to survive the present. And so when we look back at the women of Goguryeo, let us not ask how they could live that way. Let us ask how they endured it with grace. Let us not mock the garlic, the fat, the soot. Let us see instead the strength it took to carry those traditions forward, not for comfort, but for meaning. Because in the end, history doesn't need to smell good, it only needs to be remembered. Somewhere tucked away in a forgotten wooden chest lies an old braid of hair wrapped in a faded cloth hardened by time and oil. The fabric once clung to the head of a woman who lived in a world where smoke was cleansing, where scent was spirit, and where cleanliness was not seen but felt. The braid carries no name, no inscription, but its scent, faint, musky, impossible to identify, lingers. A whisper from a time when hygiene meant something else entirely. To look back at history is to breathe in a mixture of awe and discomfort. The past is never neat, never sterile. It doesn't smell of lavender or lemon soap. It smells of labor, of survival, of unspoken rituals that defied logic but offered belonging. The women of Goguryeo lived not by modern codes of hygiene, but by the rhythms of their environment and the heartbeat of their beliefs. They were shaped by mountain winds, frozen rivers, and fires that never fully chased away the cold. She did not choose the matted cloth around her head because it was elegant. She wore it because it was hers, because the scent it held was her own, mingled with the spirits of ancestors, with the warmth of home, with the memory of rites whispered under the stars. She lived in a world where scent was memory, where to be known was to be smelled, not just seen. For modern eyes, these habits may seem unbearable, but these women never sought approval from the future. They sought harmony with the present they inhabited. Their practices were practical, spiritual, and deeply personal. They understood that to be clean was not to be rid of scent, but to be full of the right one. The smell of aged fat, of burnt herbs, of wind-dried cloth. These were not signs of neglect. They were badges of connection to the land and to the unseen. It is tempting to laugh, to cringe, to marvel at the strangeness of it all. But to do so is to miss the deeper truth that every time has its own scent. Ours may be of sanitizer and shampoo. Theirs was of smoke and skin. Neither is more human than the other. Just different reflections of the same need to belong, to be clean in the way one's world defines it. And so, as we fold this chapter of ancient life, let us do so gently. Let us not judge the women who walked with unwashed feet and garlic on their breath. Let us thank them for enduring a world that was hard and cold and beautiful in its own way. Let us honor the braid in the chest, not as a relic of something filthy, but as a reminder that the past still lingers sometimes in the faintest breath of wind. Because history doesn't always come to us in books or monuments. Sometimes it comes as a scent you can't name, a cloth you almost dare not touch, a memory that clings to the air. And in that moment, the past is not dead. It's just waiting for someone to inhale.